everybody. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
You are very welcome to our corner of the internet, where for this month on the Colonizers World Tour, we are looking at queer experiences in the global scale. So these 4 countries that we've picked because I found a piece of art that a LGBTQIA website said was a good one they would recommend, one they would go forward, and then we picked the countries based therein. So our first stop is Taiwan, because the movie we will be talking about tomorrow is called Your Name Engraved Herein. It is on Netflix, and it made lots and lots of buzz when it came out in 2020, and so we had it on a list. But today, in order to set up the understanding for tomorrow, because the summary of tomorrow's movie is it takes place at the end of martial law. Why is there martial law, you may ask? That's such a great question that we would love to answer for you today, because we ourselves had that question. So, Erin, what did you know about Taiwan before we started researching?
I knew it was an island, and that was it. Like, I couldn't tell you where, I couldn't tell you what, I didn't know, like, I knew nothing. I know a lot now, but I'm still very confused. But I feel like that's par for the course. But yeah, I was like thinking about it this weekend. I was like, we get demonetized on YouTube for, you know, things we talk about and things we say. And I was like, we might get demonetized for talking about Taiwan because it's big time controversial. We learned a lot about it. What did you know?
I knew that it was controversial. I remember when the Hong Kong handover happened from the British government back to the Chinese government, that there was a lot of conversation about Taiwan. And I remember at every Olympics, they march under, I think it's called Chinese Taipei.
Chinese Taipei, yeah.
And the NBC announcers always make a point to say these are the Taiwanese people. So like there was all those little bits in my brain that something was afoot on the island of Taiwan, but I didn't know why, or I didn't really understand. My impression, I'll say this before coming, was that the Taiwanese people desperately wanted independence, and the Chinese government would not give it to them. And in fact, the truth is significantly more complicated than that, which is often the case. So really glad we studied this week. Also, we had the privilege, as we're talking, last week we were in New York and we got to go to a Taiwanese restaurant and eat beef noodle soup. And it was a really, really lovely experience. Also discovered that Taiwanese popcorn chicken is a delicacy, and it includes cinnamon and allspice, which is a little bit different than the KFC popcorn chicken that I grew up eating with Cisco honey mustard sauce. So, the world is wide. Let's go to the map, shall we? All right, so for anyone who's unaware, Taiwan is just off the coast of China. It's in the East China Sea, the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, the Taiwanese Strait. It's north of the Philippines. And one of the videos that we watched said that it is like the point of the question mark of the Japanese archipelago. And that's so true. It is so key for like every shipping route in that area, nearly every air route in that area. It's a deal. It's a deal. About 23.5 million people live in Taiwan, which when you see its size is quite impressive. And its capital is Taipei, and the biggest city is New Taipei City. The difference between those things, I don't know. Language is officially Mandarin. There are dialects, 16 indigenous languages, and Taiwanese, but predominantly everything I read was in school you're taught Mandarin. Everybody is fluent in Mandarin. And the ethnic and indigenous, here's where things get real messy. So immediately off the bat, guys, we're in mess off the bat. So the Han Chinese are about 95% of the population, ethnically, DNA-wise, whatever. How many of those identify as Han Chinese? I don't know. How many of those identify as Taiwanese? I don't know. So this is one of those really interesting countries where your biological determinants and your cultural choices may be very, very different. There are 16 officially recognized indigenous groups. from the Amis, the Atayal, the Banoon. We're going to list them all in the downstairs, actually, because I will butcher every single name, and they deserve the dignity of having their names said. The Taiwan new dollar is the currency, and as we discussed, it is 30 new dollars to $1 US, which is not terrible for a developing economy, which should not still be developing, but we'll get back to that. It's a semi-presidential republic. What does that mean? That's a fantastic question, and I would encourage you to go to the downstairs links and discover exactly what it means. Because especially the one that I would recommend the most for this, I think, explaining the political system, is the video that John Oliver did on Last Week Tonight. I think that's the best explanation of exactly how the politics are working. He filmed it in October of 2021. So with the slight caveat that it's, about 6 months out of date on some things, it does not appear to be 6 months out of date on the major thrust of how things work. Religiously, it's fascinating. Sociologist of religion, I want to spend so much more time in Taiwan. So it's about like 30% Buddhist, 30% Tao, which is not surprising when we have a very Chinese and Japanese influenced area. And then about 20% unspecified, and the rest is a mixture between folk religions and Christianity. This is one of the few places that the colonizing church didn't show up and really plant itself, especially in East Asia. The Dutch tried, and people were like, nah. And Buddhism just flourished after the Dutch left. It's fascinating. If you don't know a lot about Taoism, just really, really briefly, it's a belief in the immortality of the human soul but that immortality can only be found if you follow the way of Tao. Tao literally means the way. And there's a oneness of life. People compare it a lot to the Force in Star Wars. And I think that's probably derivative and maybe a little bit rude. But if that helps you understand the way that you kind of do this, then that's what it is. It's achievable to anyone as long as you follow the way. And Buddhism is a little bit more common, so I'm going to assume you understand that a little bit more. So here's the economy real quick. And I know Erin's going to pop in on this because she's got a really great example about fruit that we should talk about. But what's really fascinating is for a good chunk of the first half of the 20th century, they were colonized by Japan. And under that colonization, Japan was big on technological innovation and really, they had an incredible economy. And then the Chinese showed up. And we have this really weird thing where the mainland Chinese economy is kind of garbage. It doesn't have a lot of technological innovation. It's really still agricultural. It's not well organized. The yuan is like all over the place and nobody knows what to do. And Taiwan is like stable and functioning and manufacturing is really high and everything's great. But then because of the Chinese kind of influence and decisions about their economic policy at the time, they really stagnated. So they were super advanced in the 50s. And then when we hit the 60s, 70s, and 80s, not so much. So there's a lot of really, there's some huge companies that are Taiwanese. And then, but there's still a real economic disparity on the island. Am I explaining it pretty well, Erin?
I think so, yeah. I mean, they're having a difficult time right now, especially because, we'll get into some of the whys of these, but they have increasing diplomatic isolation as well since 1971. And my history of colonization is going to be part history of colonization, part like contemporary Taiwan, because you can't understand what's going on with Taiwan without understanding really its ongoing relationship with China and with the rest of the world. But it has a low birth rate and a rapidly aging population, which doesn't help the economy either. So there's increasing competition from Asia and other Asian, or from China and other Asian Pacific markets. So all of that has raised kind of this increasing insecurity about future labor shortages.
Yeah.
declining tax revenues, like all the things we know from a low fertility rate and an aging population that will have economic issues. So the number of people over 65 are expected to count for nearly 20% of the island's population by 2020.
That's even higher than Italy.
20.
And like, that's,
yeah,
wow.
By 2025. Yeah. So, it's interesting. And, one of the Jeopardy Fun Facts that I'm going to do right now, because we're talking about the economy, is its relationship with China, comes from its relationship with China. So it has very close economic ties with the mainland, which we'll get into why. Is it part of the Chinese mainland? Is it not? Is it independent? There's so many questions about Taiwan. But one of the growing economic crises they're having right now is in the Chinese enacting economic difficulties through fruit. And when I saw that, I mean, it's clickbait from Vox. The link is in the Google Docs in the downstairs, but man, is it fascinating clickbait. So essentially what happened is the Chinese government decided that they were going to impact the Taiwanese economy through agriculture. So there is a particular fruit that now I'm not going to remember the name. They talk all about it in that Vox video that is grown. Atamoya?
Yeah,
Atamoya, I think.
It's like a sour apple. Like,
yeah. It is grown endemically to Taiwan. And the biggest importer of it was China, mainland China. So they increased their demand. They were like, we want all the atamoyas. Please, more. We need more atamoyas. We don't have enough atamoyas. And so literally a bunch of farmers in Taiwan like got rid of all their other crops, started growing exclusively atamoyas, and then the Chinese were like, oh, we can't take them anymore. They're infested with disease. And like tanked the atamoya growers. And this was all around the time that like there was a new election in Taiwan. They elected their first female president. And she was from a different party than the party that had set up the Taiwanese government and said some things that indicated independence from China was something that they were working towards. And so the Chinese were really mad about that. So they enacted fruit warfare. So they did it first with the atamoyas in the hopes that then the agricultural sector would put pressure on the Taiwanese government to agree to a better trade deal with China. So it's all tied to the economy. After the atamoyas, they went for pineapples. And this was a whole thing that happened last year. And, you know, the COVID of it all, I think we missed it maybe on this side of the globe. But there was like solidarity pineapples.
Fascinating. I don't understand how we missed this, and I'm so sad we did.
I'm so sad we did. There were like heads of state from all over the world taking pictures with Taiwanese pineapples. Like the Taiwanese people bought all the Taiwanese pineapples that they could buy, and literally all the restaurants in Taiwan put pineapple on everything.
I love it.
And they were called freedom pineapples. So that gives you that's a little sprinkle, a little taster of what their relationship looks like with China. But yeah, fruit warfare was not something I was expecting to encounter when we stuck a pin in Taiwan for this week. Mm-mm. All right, we will roll on with demographics. The median age, as we said, is quite old in Taiwan. The median age is 43, which is bananas when we look at like some of the African countries we just covered last month, where like the median age was like 12. No, I'm kidding. It was like 18. Life expectancy is 81, so it's quite high. They have 98% literacy. We don't have a lot of information on a lot of other demographic markers, and I would imagine that is because depending on who is keeping track of them, would it be counted separately than Chinese? Who's taking the information? What is their relationship like with China? All of this stuff plays into anything we know about Taiwan has to come through that filter. For human rights, it's actually quite good for queer folks legally. we always make this distinction because legally and then socially and culturally, 2 different things, 3 different things. Taiwan was the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage in 2019. LGBTQ plus folks have broad protections under the law, including adoption for same-sex couples. They had the first transgender minister elected in the world. So all of that reading I did was very positive. And then there's still a lot of stigmatization for queer folks. And we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow in the movie, because really they've been very progressive in the last 10 years. But for a lot of time, especially under martial law, it was very regressive and very oppressive. So there's a lot of still lingering societal stigmas and discrimination against queer folks.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like that kind of stuff goes away overnight. Like, you don't pass a law and then everybody's okay with it. So, and even though Taiwan has a decent, like, it's not as disparate as some other places in urban and rural, because there's literally just not the physical space to do that. We would still caution that in smaller towns, obviously, it is more likely to find some sort of, sexuality motivated violence. Violence against women, things like that do tend to happen a little bit more in smaller towns where it's harder for people to get away quickly.
Right.
And so, all that's true despite all these things, because we know, I mean, it's illegal to do a lot of things anywhere that it's still legal to do. So, that's something to always keep in mind, especially in a place like Taiwan.
Yeah. For women, similarly to queer folks, the situation has improved a lot in the last 20 years with legal changes to women's rights, especially when it comes to marriage and divorce rights, which were pretty regressive up until then. And that was because of an after effect of the Japanese colonization of Taiwan. The Japanese have very culturally regressive wedding laws that were imposed on the people living on Taiwan. And so a lot of this has to go with has to go along with kind of the older gender norms that existed in both Japanese and Chinese societies. So historically, women were taught they had very narrow roles. After World War II, and we get the Chinese government, we'll get into that. They instituted a civil code of the Republic of China that was applied, and this code gave women the right to work and all that jazz. In 2016, women workers in Taiwan made 14.6% less than their male co-workers. So gender wage gap, shocking no one, exists in Taiwan. Their government, though, has taken a lot of pride in increasing gender equality. They have a female head of state, President Tsai Ing-wen. And in the 2016 election, women made up 30% of lawmakers. 38% voted into government positions, which is extremely high for anywhere in the world. So that was exciting news. Not so exciting news is their history of colonization.
Let's do a disclaimer here.
Yeah.
We are going to do our best to use the right words at the right time to legally reflect what the United Nations classifies as. We are probably going to mess up. We should be very clear. Taiwan is not legally a country.
Correct.
It is not a country. Whether in this way, it's a little Northern Ireland-esque. What you call it in your heart and what the rest of the governments of the world call it may be different. So we are not in meaning disrespect in any way, shape, or form, nor do we know enough to be getting into geopolitics. YouTube will absolutely demonetize this, but we're just trying to have a conversation, and it's important, I think, to understand that countryhood and statehood and government systems are never actually as black and white as we think they are. Because you can tell us that America's a representative democracy, but we can tell you what it actually looks like. So that's a little bit of what is going to happen. So Erin's going to do, I know she's going to be great, because she always is, but don't come for her if she misspeaks, because we're trying to do our best here.
Yeah, it's really, really complicated, y'all. It always is. And like one of the reasons we're fascinated with colonization and this idea of statehood and nationhood is because there are both legally defined terms for it and then culturally defined terms for it. So, you know, we come at this from having spent a good chunk of our professional careers studying Northern Ireland, which is called a country, a state, a province, occupied territory.
A protectorate, varying things. Like just have a Google for like the legal definition of Northern Ireland and you will come up with 10 different answers. So yes, legally, internationally, Taiwan is not an officially recognized country. I read a lot of articles in the Council of Foreign Relations and some other human rights places talking about whether we could classify it as one depending on these certain factors, etc., etc. Legally, this is where we are. The other thing I'd like to state before I get into this, and I'll reiterate it once I get to that point, one of the great videos in our Google Doc downstairs is from an actual political scientist, James Kerr Lindsay, who really delineated the difference here. Most people look at Taiwan and think it is about a suppressed state trying to gain independence. And that is a misconception that we have about Taiwan. The dispute about Taiwan is not about statehood. It's about governments. Where effectively Taiwan has believed since 1969, or no, earlier than that, when was it, 49, that it was the legal government for the Republic of China. Alternately, Mao Zedong, who won, quote unquote, the Civil War in China, declared that the People's Republic of China was the legal government of China. So we're having a dispute, an ongoing, very long dispute over who has the right to govern China. Now, within that, there are people who feel that they are Taiwanese, ethnically Taiwanese, other indigenous groups, Han Chinese, Japanese immigrants, all of that. There are people who want independence. There are people who don't. Because there are people for whom this is emotionally about statehood and not governance.
Yeah.
So, like, that's the other thing is, like, according to the United Nations, this is about sovereignty.
This is about governance, yeah.
But, like, I spent the weekend watching some Taiwanese TikToks that were translated, which was very nice. And it is exactly as diverse and emotional as you would think it is. For some people, this isn't on their radar at all. They don't give a flying shit what they're called. They just want to know that their taxes are going to actually fixing their country. And then there's other people for whom they would lay down their life for their idea of whatever the truth is. So it's just like every other country.
Right.
It's just like every country of people, every grouping of people. But see how easy it is for me to call it a country. Because we assume that any grouping of people is a country.
Is a country, yeah. So some of it, too, is the language that we use and whether that's officially sanctioned UN legal language or not. A lot of us slip in and out of that. So further disclaimer, we aim to speak for no Taiwanese people or Chinese people. We are not considering any or either or all of them a monolith that feels one way or the other about it. I'm going to do my best to represent the history that got us to this very complicated place that we are at. So, although it is not definitive, the majority of current evidence, genetic, archaeological, and linguistic, support the theory that Taiwan is the ultimate source for the spread of humans across the Pacific to Polynesia, which is really cool for a tiny island. The expansion, which happened from around 3000 BCE to 1200 CE, took place via the Philippines and eastern Indonesia, reached as far as Fiji and Tonga by about 900 BCE, before Common Era. From there, voyagers spread across the rest of the Pacific Islands over the next 2 millennia. So that's really cool. Taiwan was first inhabited by Austronesian people. It became home to the Han immigrants beginning in the late Ming Dynasty in the 7th century. In 1895, there was a military defeat that forced China's Qing dynasty to cede Taiwan to Japan. So thus we get the Japanese intervention, the Japanese colonization, the Japanese occupation, call it what you will. As we often say on Colonizer's World Tour, meaning no disrespect to the Japanese people, Japan kind of Japanned on Taiwan for a while. Imperial Japan, I should say. Imperial Japan on Taiwan for a while. So this was a long enough period. It lasted literally 50 years until the end of the Second World War in 1945. That a lot of Taiwanese culture became assimilated into Japanese culture and vice versa. So they spoke Japanese, they had Japanese dress and traditions, all of that. Taiwan came under Chinese nationalist, Kuomintang, Chinese nationalist control after World War II. So this was the period I talked to you about already, that was called the Chinese Civil War. So it was a war between Chinese factions, the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, and the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong. So
Mao won. Congratulations
Mao won.
to Mao.
Congratulations, Mao. And so the nationalist forces, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were forced off the mainland and moved to Taiwan.
And let me interject here that famously, Chiang Kai-shek was like totally anti-Taiwan before this. Like, he hated it. He thought it was a total mud palace. Like, so you can imagine Chiang Kai-shek and all of his dudes show up. Yeah. And these people that he's been mocking for a couple decades are like, pardon?
And he's like, hi, I'm your new government.
I'm your new government. I need you all to move to accommodate my entire people group. You're welcome.
Yeah. Is, as we said, very, very complicated. So the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War was in 1949. So the nationalist-controlled Republic of China government and 2 million nationalists, not a small number, fled to Taiwan and continued to claim to be the legitimate government for mainland China. So this is where we get the distinction between what they called themselves, the Republic of China, and Mao Zedong named his government the People's Republic of China, as we still understand it today. So both claimed to be the legitimate governments of China.
Rough.
Yeah. So this happened. And until 1987, the nationalist government ruled Taiwan under a Civil War martial law era declaration that dated back to 1948.
Like, complete with uniforms.
Yeah, it was intense martial law period for a long time. So that will come into our discussion tomorrow. I won't get into it today. But now we get into international politics between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China and the rest of the world, which was a rabbit hole I did not know I was going to fall under. So very quickly, beginning in the 1970s, like the 1960s, we start to get a growing economic presence from the People's Republic of China and from Mao's government, thus forcing international countries and organizations to consider how they were recognizing the governments. So up until that point, from 1949 until the late 1960s, the United Nations, the United States, all recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan as the legal government of China. But all the economic things we talked about, Dr. Kristen already talked about, I've already talked about, led to the People's Republic of China becoming a growing economic presence. And in 1971 was when the Republic of China, the Taiwanese government of China, lost their status on the UN Security Council. And they gave it to, UN Security Council gave it to the People's Republic of China, the communist government. So then all of a sudden, Taiwan becomes very murky legally in terms of government, nationhood, all of that jazz. So that is the current situation we still find ourselves in. David Sheffer from the Council on Foreign Relations had this great quote. The international legal status of Taiwan is fraught with controversy. Today, the government in Taiwan describes the Republic of China as a sovereign and independent state that maintains its own national defense and conducts its own foreign affairs. This is a political evolution in recent decades that has created a vibrant democracy on the island, which functions as a de facto independent entity. For now, most Taiwanese people support maintaining the status quo. But opinion polls asking about Taiwan's future show that sentiment among the Taiwanese people spans the spectrum between favoring independence and preferring unification with the mainland. Indeed, without the threat of a People's Republic of China military invasion, both the government and people of Taiwan would likely opt for independence as an economically dynamic island nation with cultural and trade ties to the mainland. Super, super complicated. The nationalist authorities on the island, also starting in the 1970s with this same global economic and security council shift, began to incorporate the native and indigenous population into the governing structure. The democratization progress expanded in the 1980s. And then we've had Taiwan's first at the time illegally formed opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party, but they lifted martial law in 1987, and then they've had the last 30 or 40 years to kind of work on what being a democracy looks like, which is why it's a semi-presidential republic. It's real complicated.
And I should also say, because we didn't really cover this, just so you're just for anyone curious, the first time that somebody who was not Taiwanese showed up on the island of Taiwan was in the 7th century before the Common Era.
Yeah.
So like they've been, and the Chinese folks began to settle there in the 3rd century of the Common Era. So all of these machinations, you know, we hear a lot of like, well, the Taiwanese people didn't consent to this. We should say that all of this stuff, like no one's voted for it. Like,
right.
No one has demonstrated active consent.
Yeah, Chiang Kai-shek didn't hold a referendum before he declared it the Republic of China.
And one of the reasons that the Security Council gave it to the People's Republic was because Chiang Kai-shek was so busy being a dick to his people that he didn't do any economic development. He didn't do anything except control them. Honestly, that's all he seemed to do. Like the government. I mean, any sort of dictatorship, economy always stagnates under dictatorship. Always.
Right.
And so it did in that case too. So the Taiwanese people, the inhabitants of the island of Taiwan, be they indigenous, Han Chinese, which was there for the longest for sure, be they Japanese, be they American missionaries, I don't care. At no point in time have they actually been given a ballot to ask. So all the polls you see are hypothetical. And we should also say that a lot of this was done before the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Oh, Lord, y'all, we didn't even get to that.
And there was a lot of, if you look on Google, there's going to be a lot of YouTube videos from the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022 that are going to talk about increased Chinese aggression towards Taiwan.
Right.
And then when Vladed, and it has not been going well for him, it appears that the Chinese government has dialed that overt military aggression back. But the current president of the People's Republic of China has declared that Taiwan is theirs and unification is a priority. So watch this space. This is a, you know, we say it all the time that like we should all care about everything. I recognize you can't. But there's a couple countries that for the global economy you should pay attention to. Brazil is definitely one. And we have Brazilian elections coming up in October of 22. But the other, honestly, is to keep an eye on Taiwan. Because what the Chinese government does about Taiwan and then what the United Nations does in response about Taiwan is going to be very educational to the rest of us about some geopolitical movements. So just set up a quick Google alert, get educated about this one. We're going to keep tracking it for sure. Because it's significantly also more crucial than I realized to geopolitics. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like, there's been a lot of U.S. intervention in the past, and currently there were, the U.S. Navy stationed ships in the Taiwan Strait in between mainland China and Taiwan at points of this increased threat. And there's a ton of articles out there from, October of last year to January of this year talking about the potential invasion or military action of China, the People's Republic of China, against Taiwan. And now a lot of people are like, whoa. Ukraine didn't go well for Russia, so maybe China's going to be like, hold up. Now's not the time for claiming sovereignty over a country that is de facto independent, as we said.
Yeah. We should say the official U.S. position is that we acknowledge China's claim to Taiwan, but we don't consent to China's claim to Taiwan, but we acknowledge it.
We acknowledge it, right.
This is my favorite piece of statescraft I've ever read. We acknowledge, but we do not consent. I'm like, so the U.S. has an empathetic response to China's belief about Taiwan.
Understanding is not condoning, folks. We understand. We do not condone. Yeah, and it's a real tricky position, obviously, because China has advanced nuclear weapons.
And some emotional feelings about United States as it is. So
is not a big fan of the United States. Massive in the global economy. Obviously. We've seen this throughout the pandemic and shortages and inflation and all of this stuff. So all of that plays into it.
Yeah.
Regardless of what an individual person who lives on Taiwan thinks or feels about it.
Which is the case for independent movements all over the world.
All over the show. Yeah, but it is one of the most fascinating geopolitical conversations you and I have had.
Ever.
And it's, where I'm looking at my phone, we're at the almost 40-minute mark here, and there's stuff we haven't covered.
Tons.
But I think the last thing I wanted to say is that it's really important to understand how long Taiwan was under one-party rule. Because that's a huge part of this as well. So even though they transitioned out of martial law in the late 80s, the Kuomintang Party was the main party until 2000, when the first time that there was a peaceful transfer of power and the KMT lost to the DPP.
So what's that, 50 odd years?
From 49, from 49 to 2000, is nuts. So it was a long time to be under one party rule, and they had two other transitions of power in 2008 and 2016, which is very important to note that currently Taiwan is governed by the DPP, and you can understand a lot of the fruit warfare because of this interesting and evolving understanding of what they think sovereignty and independence means and what the People's Republic of China thinks it means. So on that vague and hopefully explanatory note, we should say, if you're watching this and you're Chinese and you're Taiwanese or you're any category at all and you're invested in this and you have thoughts and feelings, feel free to comment below. If we screwed something up, I apologize. I did my best. But yeah, you and I are just all abuzz with what's happening on here. But it's time now for our Jeopardy Fun Facts. I know you have several. I have narrowed mine down to one because I already gave my other one, which was the fruit warfare. My Jeopardy Fun Fact is that they instituted very recently musical recycling trucks. Recycling trucks that play delightful music, kind of like ice cream trucks here in the United States, but not as annoying.
I was about to say,
music.
Okay.
Yeah. So they've turned recycling and trash collection into a community event. This is something I think that would only succeed in more communalist and communalized national identities. So we're way on the individual end of the spectrum. They're on the very, very communal and collectivist end of the spectrum. So Taiwan used to be called Trash Island because it was the place with the worst recycling rate on the planet. There was just trash everywhere. So they decided to have this, like, we're going to start playing nice music on the recycling trucks. Everyone come out at night when they hear the music, and we all recycle together. And they now have the highest recycling rate in the world at 55%. And part of it is this collectivist national identity and cultural identity that works in the favor of the recycling, because they interviewed this one woman in the video I watched, and she was like, yeah, like if you don't come out to recycle when the truck comes, like all the neighbors talk about it and you could be like shamed for not doing your recycling. So again, that's not something that would happen here in the United States, but I salute them for their ingenuity. And it sounds like a nice time. Everybody comes out, they recycle, they throw their trash, they chit chat about the day. It's a whole thing. And now they lead the world in recycling. So go Taiwan. And to you and your list of fun facts, because so many things from Taiwan.
So we learned that the following are Taiwanese invention. 1, cat cafes.
Yay, Taiwan.
2, instant noodles, to which my husband thanks you greatly, because pot noodles are like his favorite thing. And then bubble tea. Also a Taiwanese invention. Really exciting. Also, superconductors, which we use in everything, like everything. But one of the major things we use is like superconductors are like tiny engines that you can put in tiny things. So lots of sex toys are powered by Taiwanese superconductors. So thanks for that on behalf of all humans everywhere who make that choice. And also that somebody of Taiwanese descent who was actually living in China at the time invented the N95 mask. And somebody of Taiwanese descent who lived in the US at the time invented the USB drive. So,
whoa.
USB flash drive, excuse me, like the thumb drives, but still.
Yeah.
External storage was invented. Thank you,
By
Taiwan.
Taiwanese.
Boba tea and sex toys. Thank you, Taiwan.
And cat cafes. Like, what else do we need?
Very little.
What else do we need? Amazing. So many fun facts. We were talking about it before filming, and Kristen was like, I don't know which one to pick. I was like, dude, have them all. How many fun facts can... Normally we try and reduce it to one, but whatever. There was too many.
Oh my gosh, the one I forgot is that every town has its own mascot.
Oh my god, the mascots.
Okay, you have to watch the John Oliver video to learn about the mascots.
So many mascots, you guys. It's fascinating.
And on that note, something else that is fascinating is how the country transitioned out of martial law, to be completely honest. That may be a messy transition, but it's really not. There is no other country, there's no other area, other people group that I know of that was under martial law for that long. That then transitioned out of martial law, but still into the ruling party. Like, this is a very unique situation. So tomorrow's movie, Your Name Engraved Herein, which is the highest grossing LGBTQ movie in Taiwan of all time, and is the first LGBTQ movie to pass 100 million Taiwanese dollars. So big deal over there, very beloved, and we're excited to be able to talk about it. It takes place again in 1987 and centers around two boys, really, who are in high school when that happens, and what that looks like for them. So we really hope that you join us for that.
If you do or do not, if you enjoyed this coverage at all, please do all the YouTube-y things, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our other fascinating attempts at jumping into geopolitics and all the other things that we do in this corner of the internet. As per usual, you will find all the relevant links in the Living Google Doc in the downstairs, as well as a link to our weekly newsletter. If you would like to hear from us about other things in written form instead of video form, we would love to have you join us and be a part of that community as well. If we see you next for your name engraved herein, or wherever we see you next, we hope to see you soon. Take care.
Bye, everybody.